Hey guys. Tonight, we begin with a world where being poor didn't just mean skipping dinner. It meant your entire life was one long game of survival. It's Victorian London. A city of gas lamps, horse-drawn carriages, and so much coal smoke you could practically chew the air. But beneath the glitter of wealth, most people were crammed into filthy slums, wondering if tomorrow would be any better. The world is smoky, crowded, and stacked against you from the start. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up poor in Victorian London, and the day ahead isn't going to be kind. You open your eyes to the heavy air of London, somewhere around the year 1850, and immediately regret taking that deep breath. The smell is, how shall we put it? Think of the aroma of a damp dog that's rolled in sewage, left in the sun for 3 days, and then politely set on fire. That's the city greeting you with open arms. Welcome to Victorian poverty. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so is everyone else around you? And they've all forgotten the meaning of soap. The first thing that hits you is the sound. A chorus of clattering hooves on cobblestone streets, hawkers shouting about fish that are very clearly not fresh, children crying, someone coughing up what you suspect is half a lung, and above it all, the bell of Sate. Paul's reminding you that time is passing. Not that you'll be doing anything particularly productive with it today. If you're poor, time doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the landlord, the factory foreman, and the endless stomach growl you've been ignoring since yesterday. You step forward carefully because the street itself is alive. Puddles of something unholy, piles of dung. Heaps of refuse tossed from windows without a second thought. One wrong step and your boots, which are already falling apart, become an unfortunate soup spoon for Victorian leftovers. Oh, and speaking of boots, don't get attached to them. Many poor Londoners don't have any, and the only thing worse than stepping into mystery liquid is doing so barefoot. At least your shoes give you the illusion of dignity, even if they squeak like a depressed mouse with every step. The buildings loom around you, tall and crooked, leaning in as though conspiring about your misfortune. Dark brick walls stained with coal smoke, windows so grimy they might as well be painted black, and laundry lines strung between houses like sad bunting for a party that nobody was invited to. Inside those homes, if you can call them that, families are crammed tighter than commuters on the London Underground at rush hour. Except here, you're not late for work. Here, you're just late for death. Someone brushes past you. A boy of maybe 8 years old, though he looks smaller. His face pale and thin as if hunger has hollowed him from the inside. He's selling matches. Not that anyone's buying, because everyone's too busy avoiding starvation themselves. He glances up at you with a look that says, "Care to spare a penny?" But he doesn't ask. Begging could land him in prison, and prison, ironically, sometimes means better meals than freedom. Still, his eyes linger. You pat your pockets instinctively, though you already know they're as empty as your stomach. And here's the thing: you might imagine poverty as just not having enough. But in Victorian London, it's an entire ecosystem. It's the fog that clings to your clothes, the soot that settles in your lungs, the gnawing worry that every cough might be the beginning of the end. And of course, the eternal question of whether you can afford bread today, not bread in the sense of fresh, golden loaves, but more like dense lumps of questionable dough that would double nicely as a weapon in self-defense. Speaking of bread, your stomach growls loudly enough that the man selling eels on the corner shoots you an annoyed look. Eels, yes. Because apparently, when God created fish, Londoners decided, let's eat the slippery one that looks like a snake. They're sold cheap, chopped up, and boiled into pies that smell suspiciously like the Thames, which, for the record, is the closest thing the 19th century had to a biological weapon. The Thames at this time is less river, and more liquid graveyard of everything mankind has ever thrown away. If you fall in, congratulations, you've met your ancestors early. You're distracted from this cheery thought by a sudden shout. Across the way, a man is being hauled down the street by two others. Peelers, the police of the day, named after Sir Robert Peel. They've caught him stealing bread, which is ironic, given half the constables probably stole their own dinner last night. He protests, but no one intervenes. The poor don't defend each other publicly. Drawing attention means risk, and in this world, survival is quieter than morality. Now, you might be thinking, surely the government helps the poor. Ah, you sweet summer child. They do, but only in the sense that a cat helps, a mouse find enlightenment. The poor law means you can technically get assistance, but it often involves entering the dreaded workhouse. Imagine prison, but less fun. Meals of watery gruel, families split apart, labor until your bones feel like kindling. Many choose starvation in the streets over that indignity. And honestly, after smelling the cabbage soup of a workhouse, you might too. A horse-drawn cart rattles by, and you notice it's not carrying goods but bodies. Children mostly, and the occasional old man, covered in rags. They're being taken to the parish for burial, because poverty has a way of making mortality feel routine. People don't stop and stare. They don't even pause. Death here is as common as coal dust. If anything, the only shock is when someone manages to live past 40. And as you walk further, you begin to notice how cleverly the city hides its poor. The wealthy ride their carriages a street away, blissfully unaware, or pretending to be. They attend glittering balls, sip champagne, discuss literature, while entire families just a mile off huddle together, passing disease back and forth like a family heirloom. It's a city of masks, where the rich wear velvet and the poor wear dirt, but both pretend not to notice the other. You glance upward. Laundry flaps overhead, but so do banners for a circus coming to town. Entertainment, you realize, is as much an escape for the poor as for anyone else. A penny for a freak show, if you can spare it. A moment to laugh at something more unfortunate than yourself. Though, considering your current lodging options include a doss house, where you sleep sitting up, tied to a rope with strangers, you're already part of a freak show, just not one anyone's paying to see. Imagine explaining this to someone today. Yes, hello. I'd like to pay money to sit in a row with strangers, all of us tied to a communal rope, so we don't fall forward while we nap. And someone else replying, so basically economy class on an airplane. See, relatable. And yet, despite all this, there's a strange liveliness to the streets. Children kick a rag, stuffed ball, women gossip as they scrub laundry, men argue loudly about politics none of them can change. Survival, in its own way, breeds a sort of vibrancy. Life refuses to stop, even when it's grimy and gasping. You turn a corner and step into an alleyway that narrows so much it feels like the buildings are conspiring to crush you. The ground is uneven, damp, and lined with the detritus of daily survival broken pots, fish bones, fragments of coal, and the occasional rat staring at you with the casual arrogance of a landlord. The air is thicker here, the smell a blend of mildew, sweat, and something distinctly human that makes you question whether chamber pots were really emptied at all, or if the residents just decided gravity was a good enough servant. A woman leans out of an upstairs window, yelling in a shrill voice at a man stumbling below. You can't tell whether they're arguing about money, love, or something more trivial, like bread gone missing. But the words spill out with such venom, you feel like you've accidentally tuned into the Victorian version of a reality TV show. The man shouts back, slurs his speech, and you quickly realize Jin has entered the chat. Jin, the faithful friend of the poor, the warm blanket that doubles as a hangman's noose. Cheap, plentiful, and strong enough to turn despair into laughter for about 10 minutes before turning laughter into unconsciousness in the gutter. And oh, the gin palaces. You pass one now, its glowing gas lamps spilling golden light onto the street like a beacon of false hope. Inside, men and women crowd shoulder to shoulder, the air alive with noise and spilled liquor. The smell is sweet and sharp, a heady perfume of intoxication. For a penny, you too could drink yourself into blessed forgetfulness. The Victorians had a saying, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for two. It's less a joke and more of a business model. But you don't step inside. For one thing, you don't have the penny. For another, you're not sure your body could survive the strain. You've already inhaled enough coal smoke to qualify as a chimney. Adding gin to the mix might just cause spontaneous combustion. Instead, you walk past, catching the glimmer of hollow eyes staring out at you from the smoky haze, faces flushed with drink and desperation. Further along, the alley opens into a courtyard of sorts, though courtyard is a generous term. It's more of a communal dumping ground, with the bonus feature of being where people also live. Children scurry barefoot through the muck, their laughter oddly cheerful despite the conditions. Mothers sit on stoops, mending torn clothes with hands that look too tired to finish the task. A dog barks at nothing in particular. Somewhere above, a violin squeaks a tune that might once have been beautiful if the strings hadn't been worn down to near silence. You pause near a small doorway where the smell of boiling water drifts out, faintly mixed with cabbage. The famous poor man's meal, cabbage soup. It's astonishing what Victorians could stretch into dinner. A leaf here, a potato there, all boiled until it became a broth thin enough to mistake for flavored air. And yet, in these cramped quarters, people gather around their tin bowls, grateful for warmth, grateful for something to put in their bellies. Hunger in this city is less about absence, and more about the constant presence of not enough. Of course, in today's world, cabbage soup has become some sort of health fad. You know, the cleanse diets, promising to reset your system if you eat nothing but watery cabbage for a week. Victorian Londoners would love to hear that. Imagine explaining it. Ah yes, my good sir, I willingly eat starvation food as a lifestyle choice. They'd laugh until their ribs hurt, or until they remembered their ribs are visible through their own skin. But laughter, here is as much currency as coin. You hear it suddenly from a group of dockworkers, gathered around a fire in a barrel. Their hands are red from labor, their clothes thick with grime, but the story one of them tells, probably exaggerated, probably obscene, has them doubled over. You catch only snippets, words like boss's wig and donkey, and decide perhaps it's best not to know the full details. In poverty, humor is rebellion. If the world beats you down, you answer with a joke, even if it's filthy, even if it's cruel. Especially then. The night deepens, and lamps flicker in their glass cages along the street. Shadows stretch, voices soften, and the city seems to exhale a long, weary sigh. You notice now the queues forming near the lodging houses, the doss houses, where for a few pennies you can secure a place to sleep. The line is long, faces pale and desperate, each person clutching what little they own. Some carry nothing but themselves. The promise is simple: 4 walls, a roof, and space to collapse until morning. But the reality, well, you'll see soon enough. For now, you drift closer, listening to the murmurs of those waiting. A woman with tangled hair whispers to her child, soothing him despite her own hollow eyes. A man scratches his arm constantly, as though fleas are staging a mutiny beneath his sleeve. Another clutches a rolled-up coat, stroking it like a prized possession. And it is, because coats aren't just clothing here, they're survival. Lose yours in the winter, and you might not see spring. The door creaks open, and the lodgers shuffle in. You follow, stepping into a world that feels less like shelter and more like a human terrarium. The air hits you first, thick, sour, a stew of sweat, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and that faint cabbage tang still clinging from dinner. The room is packed, every inch occupied by people pressed together in rows. Some sit hunched over, some lie on narrow wooden boards, others just curl up on the floor. Privacy is a luxury, space a myth. At the back, you notice the infamous rope beds. Imagine a thick rope stretched across the room, shoulder height, where people lean forward, resting their bodies while they sleep in a grotesque parody of comfort. It's cheap, efficient, and utterly absurd. The next morning, the ropes are cut down, and the guests tumble forward to wake up. No need for alarm clocks when gravity does the job. Try picturing this in today's terms. Hello, sir. Would you like the deluxe suite? Or perhaps the budget option, where you get to nap hanging off a laundry line like a Victorian bat? It makes you want to laugh, until you realize people here really do choose this. Not for novelty, but because it's the only thing they can afford. Somewhere nearby, a man coughs. A wet, rattling sound that makes the hairs on your arms rise. Consumption, the great plague of the poor. Tuberculosis stalks these places like a hunter, passing silently from one to another until a family is reduced to silence. Doctors call it romantic, painting pale cheeks and fever, bright eyes in poetry. The reality is blood-stained rags and an end that comes far too soon. You wonder how many in this very room will survive the winter. You wonder if you'll survive the night. The noises lull you, oddly enough. The shuffle of feet, the murmur of hushed voices, the crackle of a dying fire. Poverty has its own lullaby, and you're caught in it now. You feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at your limbs, though part of you resists. Because once you close your eyes here, you're not sure what you'll wake up to, if you wake at all. And as you lean back against the rough wall, your mind drifts. You think of the boy with the matches, the woman with her cabbage soup, the dock workers laughing at their boss's expense. Lives knotted together by struggle, yes, but also by stubborn endurance. Somehow in the cracks of suffering, a strange resilience blooms. It's not pretty, but it's real. Still, if you thought sleeping tied to a rope in a room full of coughing strangers was the lowest point of Victorian poverty, you're in for a surprise. Wait until you see what happens when the city itself turns against you, not with hunger or cold, but with filth rising right out of the ground. The morning begins before the sun, though in truth it hardly matters, because in the East End of London the light never really wins against the smoke. Imagine waking to the cough of your neighbour, the rattle in their lungs shaking through the paper, thin wall of your room. You sit up, though not in a bed of any comfort, but on a bundle of straw gone flat from years of pressing bodies. The smell reaches you first, sour sweat, damp cloth, and the faint but constant perfume of rats, who share the place with you as if they've paid rent. You stretch, though the ceiling stoops so low you knock your knuckles on beams, blackened by soot. Congratulations, you have survived another night in Victorian poverty, though your lungs may not agree. Stepping outside doesn't help. The street greets you with puddles of yesterday's rain, though puddles is too polite. These are soup pots of filth, holding ash muck, and something floating that you pray is cabbage. The cobblestones are slick and uneven, and children dart barefoot across them, quick as sparrows, their laughter sharp and thin against the backdrop of horse hooves and wagon wheels. A coal cart rolls past, leaving behind a fog so thick you taste it on your tongue. For breakfast, you get air flavoured like chimney. Welcome to Victorian London's version of Starbucks. Always smoky, never optional. Of course, the city has its own rhythms. Street criers sing out the price of bread, milk, and anything else they can stretch a penny for. You might wander toward the market, though keep one hand on your pocket, if you even have one. Pickpockets thrive here, and they can pluck a crust of bread from your fingers faster than you can say, thief. The police patrol, but not here, not really. They stick to the places where the respectable live, where their uniforms look tidy in gaslight. Down here, in the alleys off Whitechapel, law and order is more a suggestion, like washing vegetables before you eat them. And if you think you can wander the streets without meeting trouble, think again. A man selling penny dreadfuls shoves a crumpled pamphlet into your chest. Tales of murder, blood dripping across woodcut illustrations. You read one headline while dodging the splash from a passing carriage. Ghastly child murder in Spitalfields. Lovely morning entertainment, wouldn't you say? Imagine reading that over your eggs, if you could afford eggs. Then again, today's clickbait headlines aren't so different. At least now the pictures don't come with actual rats nibbling at the corners. Progress, of a sort. You pass by a row of lodging houses, the kind where a halfpenny gets you a spot on a rope stretched across the room. Yes, a rope. No bed, no mattress. Just a line hung at shoulder height. Men pay their coin, lean forward onto it, and dangle asleep like discarded laundry. It's cheaper than a coffin bed, where for a penny you can curl up in a wooden box with a lid. You may laugh, but the box at least offers privacy. Think of it as the Victorian version of capsule hotels, only with more lice and no vending machine snacks. The people here are inventive because they must be. A woman washes rags in a bucket and hangs them over a line stretched between windows. They drip brown water down into the street. She catches you looking and barks. What? Never seen laundry before. You nod and walk on quickly, because staring costs you more than manners. It risks a slap or a thrown boot. Hunger makes tempers sharp. You'll notice too, the number of children darting about without parents in sight. Half-orphans, street urchins, call them what you like. Some sing for coins, others beg. Some simply vanish into doorways when the constable rounds the corner. Childhood here is not about toys or schoolwork. It's about surviving the day without losing your shoes. You make your way toward the Thames, though the river doesn't welcome you with fresh breezes. Instead, it coughs up its filth at low tide, stinking mud, broken barrels, the occasional carcass of something once alive. Mudlarks search along the banks, mostly children again, digging with bare hands through the slime for nails, bits of rope, or even bone they can sell. Their fingers crack and bleed, but they grin when they find anything worth a farthing. Meanwhile, respectable citizens stroll across the bridges above, holding scented handkerchiefs to their noses, pretending the river is just a scenic backdrop and not a flowing sewer, and you thought your city's rush hour smelled bad. If you want work, you'll find it in the docks or the factories. The factories hum like giant beasts, swallowing men, women, and children by the hundreds. The air inside is worse than the streets, lint, soot, fumes so thick you feel them coat your teeth. The machines don't pause for clumsy fingers or tired eyes. One slip, and you leave work with fewer parts than you entered. No sick leave, no benefits. Just the knowledge that someone else will take your place by tomorrow morning. You might think of modern office jobs, staring at glowing screens for 10 hours. But at least when you mess up Excel, you keep your hands. Lunch, if you can call it that, is bought from a street vendor. Hot pies filled with mystery meat, which is a polite way of saying you don't want to know what's in them. Some swear they've seen dog tails sticking out of the crust. Others whisper about cats gone missing. You take a bite anyway, because hunger doesn't ask questions. The pastry is greasy, the filling chewy, and the aftertaste lingers like regret. Still, it's warm, and that's enough to keep you walking. Think of it as Victorian fast food, cheap, questionable, and leaving you with stomach pain 2 hours later. Victorians, open all day, every day. As you wander further, you notice the contrast growing sharper. Grand carriages roll past, their passengers hidden behind velvet curtains, faces powdered, boots polished. They glide through the same streets where children sleep on doorsteps and women clutch their shawls tight against the cold. The divide is not subtle. It's carved into every street corner, every gas lamp, every glance of disdain from those who ride while others trudge. And the city thrives on this contrast, feeding itself on the backs of the poor while parading wealth like a carnival. If envy were fuel, London could have lit the whole empire without coal. Night comes quickly, as though the city prefers its sins hidden in shadow. Gas lamps flicker to life, casting yellow halos through the fog. The streets grow louder, then quieter, as the pubs empty into the alleys. Drunken laughter blends with angry shouts. A fight breaks out over a spilled drink or a stolen coin. Knives flash in the dark, and then silence falls again, save for the scurry of rats reclaiming their kingdom. You pull your coat tighter, though the cold still seeps in. It's not just the weather. It's the weight of being poor, of knowing tomorrow will be the same, if you are lucky enough to see it. And yet, even here life clings on with stubborn joy. A fiddler plays outside a tavern, his bow worn, strings fraying, but the tune lifts a crowd for a moment. Children clap, couples sway, and for a breath of time, laughter wins against the fog. That is the strange miracle of poverty in Victorian London. Despair and joy sit side by side, each refusing to leave. You might think of modern memes, how people can laugh at the darkest things, because sometimes laughter is the only shield left. If you thought today's walk through the streets was unsettling, just wait until you find out where many of these poor souls end their day, not in pubs or roped rooms, but in places far worse, where sanity itself is tested and lost. Shall we step inside? You think the streets are bad? You think the alleys, the rope rooms, the coffin beds, the greasy pies, and the smoke-choked lungs are as low as it goes. But London always has a basement beneath the basement, a shadow under the shadow. And tonight, as the gas lamps burn dim and the fog thickens until it feels like cotton stuffed in your throat, you realize there are places worse than poverty, places designed to contain it, punish it, and, in their own peculiar way, feed on it. The first stop, naturally, is the workhouse. Step inside and feel your spine tighten. Because here the price of survival is your dignity. Stripped down and wrung out like washing left too long in the Thames. Imagine yourself starving, your ribs pressing against your shirt, your eyes hollow. You walk through the heavy doors because you've no choice, and immediately the rules slap you like cold water. Men separated from wives. Children taken from mothers. Families broken like dropped plates, scattered into categories: male ward, female ward, child ward. It is not cruelty by accident. It is cruelty by design. The workhouse was never meant to help, only to grind. Charity, Victorian style, came with shackles. The food is worse than the street vendor's pies. Gruel, grey and thin, ladled out with all the warmth of a prison sentence. A crust of bread, hard enough to break a tooth, floats on top as though mocking you. You eat it because you must, spoon scraping against tin, the sound echoing in a hall filled with the coughs and wheezes of the desperate. Hunger is not satisfied, it is postponed. And if you thought you could steal a crumb or slip extra, know this: the workhouse guards keep eyes sharper than hawks, and punishment is swift. A beating perhaps, a locked cell, or worse, expulsion back to the streets where your hunger waits with open arms. Daylight hours are for labor. Endless, grinding labor, designed not for productivity but for punishment. Stone breaking, oakum picking, pulling apart old ropes until your fingers blister and bleed. Your skin raw from hemp fibers that leave tiny cuts to fester. Children scrub floors until their knees ache. Women sew until their vision blurs. Men haul lift, bend, until their backs seize up. And all the while, the overseers watch with sticks in hand. Imagine a factory job, except the product is not goods but obedience. The workhouse was less an institution and more a factory for crushing souls. And yet, here's the bitter irony: some went willingly. Because hunger was worse. Because the cold nights killed. Because the rope room cost more than a penny you didn't have. The workhouse was despised, but it was also a lifeline, however cruel. Survival doesn't care for pride, it only cares for breath. Now, perhaps you are lucky, or unlucky, enough to avoid the workhouse. Perhaps you keep walking down London's shadowed veins, deeper, until you find yourself staring at another institution altogether: the asylum. Bedlam, as it was known. A word whispered with both horror and fascination, because madness in Victorian London was not merely feared, it was displayed. A show, a theatre of broken minds. Imagine stepping inside, and the first thing you hear is not silence but a chorus: wails, laughter, mutters, screams, a symphony of human unraveling. The asylum smells different from the streets. Less smoke, more damp stone, sweat, and something acrid. Urine, unwashed bodies, despair soaked into walls. Patients shuffle in thin gowns, their hair matted, their eyes wide or vacant. Some rock endlessly, others lash out, and others sit perfectly still as though waiting for judgment. The attendants move between them with a mix of boredom and brutality. A slap here, a shove there, a chain rattle just to remind everyone who is in control. You may ask, how did these people arrive here? Some were truly lost to madness, their minds broken by trauma, disease, or the endless grind of poverty. But many were simply inconvenient, wives declared insane by husbands who wanted rid of them. Women too outspoken for polite society, drunkards who couldn't pay fines, poor souls who muttered too loudly in church. Madness was elastic in definition. It stretched to fit whatever society found uncomfortable. And once the asylum door shut behind you, escape was nearly impossible. Treatments, if we dare call them that, were experiments at best, tortures at worst. Cold baths to shock the mind into order. Restraints, leather straps biting into wrists. Rotational chairs that spun patients until they vomited. Bleeding, purging, because, surely, illness was simply poison needing to be drawn out. And always, the walls echoed with the sounds of protest, muffled eventually into silence. The Victorian mind, obsessed with control, found its laboratory here, in the minds of the helpless. But the most chilling part: Bedlam was once open to the public. For a penny, respectable Londoners could wander the halls and gawk at the patients, like animals in a zoo. They laughed, pointed, jeered, enjoying the spectacle of madness. Think of it as reality television's cruel ancestor, suffering turned to entertainment. And you, standing in those halls, might realize the crowd is more terrifying than the patients themselves. If the workhouse starved you and the asylum broke you, there remained one more path for many poor souls: the morgue. because poverty was not merely a way of life. It was a path to death carved at alarming speed. Diseases stalked the slums: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, spreading through water, air, and touch. You might cough in the morning and be a corpse by night, and when death came, the city claimed you with cold efficiency. Bodies lined up in sheds, waiting for relatives who rarely arrived. Paupers' graves swallowed dozens at once, coffins stacked like firewood in pits of earth. A name, if you were lucky. A number, more often. Yet even in death, the poor could not rest. Resurrection men, body snatchers, prowled graveyards at night, digging up the newly buried to sell their remains to medical schools. Corpses became commodities, dissected for the advancement of science. The irony was bitter in life. The poor were disposable in death. They became valuable, though not in ways they would have chosen. But let us return to the living, for the story is not done. Night deepens, and London's other economy wakes. The prostitutes, the thieves, the hawkers of vice. They step from shadows into gaslight, skirts hitched, eyes painted with coal, calling to passers-by. Some are barely women at all, just girls hardened too quickly by hunger. Others are older, their faces carved by years of smoke and gin. They work the alleys, the taverns, even the doorsteps of churches, because survival allows no shame. And their clients? Respectable men, judges, politicians, priests, all come cloaked in hypocrisy, handing out sermons by day and coins by night. For many, gin is the only escape. The mother's ruin, they called it, and ruin is accurate. Sold cheap, poured strong, it numbs hunger and fear in equal measure. Taverns overflow with the glassy-eyed, their words slurred, their bodies swaying. Children sip from cups handed down by mothers too tired to notice. Gin kills slowly, but it soothes quickly, and in a world like this, the latter mattered more. You may laugh or shudder at the absurdity, but ask yourself this: would you survive here? Could you walk these streets, breathe this air, eat this food, sleep in these coffins, labor under these rules, without breaking? The truth is harsh, most of us would not. We, with our clean water and antibiotics and supermarkets, would fold within a week. And yet, the poor of Victorian London lived this every day, clung to it, endured it, even carved out joys where they could. A fiddle tune, a shared loaf, a child's laugh cutting through the smog. And that is perhaps the most haunting part of all. Not the filth, not the disease, not the cruelty, but the resilience. That people, when stripped to the bone, still found a way to smile. It should humble you. It should unsettle you. Because if you listen closely, beneath the coughs and cries, beneath the rumble of carriages and the drip of water from broken gutters, you can hear it, the heartbeat of a city that thrived on suffering, yet could never quite stamp out hope. But do not get comfortable, dear traveller. We are only halfway down. There are darker alleys yet to turn into, deeper rooms yet to open, and whispers that lead us toward horrors more personal, more intimate, and far harder to leave behind. Tomorrow, perhaps we step into the brothels, into the chambers where survival wore rouge and lace, and where death hid behind silk curtains. You step off the street, and into the glow of a red lamp, its glass dusty, its flame flickering in the fog like an invitation no one dares put into words. The noise of the city softens behind you. The hawkers shouting, the rattling wheels, the cough of coal smoke rising from throats, and suddenly the air feels different, warmer, tinged with perfume that struggles to mask the sweat and gin beneath it. Welcome to the brothels of Victorian London, where poverty put on rouge, where hunger wore stockings, and where survival was traded in whispers and gaslight. The brothel is not one place, but 1,000 variations on a theme. Some are grand, with velvet curtains, gilded mirrors, and pianos tinkling in the corner, catering to gentlemen with coins to spare and reputations thick enough to survive a scandal. Others are nothing more than back rooms of taverns, beds with sheets that have seen too many bodies, where girls barely past childhood are lined up like goods in a market. Between these two extremes lies the great ocean of sex work in the city, the disorderly houses, as police called them, each with its own rules, its own smells, its own hierarchy of flesh. Inside, women move like dancers in a cruel theatre. Some smile with practiced ease, lips red, eyes painted, bodies wrapped in corsets that leave them breathless but alluring. Others show no smile at all, their faces blank, masks of survival. The madam watches from her chair, sometimes a former prostitute herself, Sometimes a woman who learned early that control was safer than service. Her eyes are sharp, her hands heavy with rings, her tongue quick to cut. She knows the business who pays well, who beats, who can be blackmailed, who must be handled gently. In this house, she is queen, and the men who enter, they are everyone. The factory foreman spending his week's wage, the soldier with mud still on his boots, the politician who preaches morality by day and slips coins into stockings by night. Priests come, too, their collars hidden, their guilt burning behind their eyes. Respectability stops at the threshold. Here all men are equal in desire. And when morning comes, they will button their coats, straighten their hats, and walk back into the fog as if nothing happened. The women, though, remain. For them, the night is not a lapse but a life. Some chose it, in a way, a choice made when every other door slammed shut. A factory wage was starvation, a workhouse was humiliation, a brothel offered food, shelter, a roof that did not leak, and sometimes even camaraderie. But many did not choose at all. They were sold by parents too desperate, seduced by promises that soared into bondage, or pressed into service by madams who knew how to spot weakness. Choice, in this world, was a word as thin as the paper advertisements, pasted to brick walls. Listen closely and you will hear the sounds of the house. The laughter, high and brittle, like glass about to crack. The creak of bed springs, rhythmic and unrelenting. The footsteps in corridors, soft but hurried, carrying cups of gin, bowls of broth, whispered instructions. The music from the parlor, a piano slightly out of tune, its melody meant to drown out the groans and the muffled cries. And beneath it all, the coughs. Always the coughs. Reminders that the body is mortal, that disease lingers like a shadow in every kiss. For venereal disease was everywhere. The doctors called it syphilis, gonorrhea, chancres, each word clinical and cold. But for the women it meant sores, fevers, blindness, madness. There were treatments, mercury rubbed on skin, swallowed in pills, dripped into wounds. But the cure often poisoned more than the illness. Many women worked until they could not, their bodies failing, their faces marked. When they died, they were not remembered as mothers, daughters, sisters, but as fallen women, a phrase society loved to whisper with pity and disgust. Fallen from what? From respectability, from innocence, from a pedestal that had never been built for them in the first place. The city pretended to condemn them. Sermons railed, newspapers clutched their pearls, reformers preached salvation. But the truth is simpler: the brothels thrived because London wanted them. Men filled the beds, coins filled the purses, and behind every moral speech was a silence bought by complicity. The police raided now and then, dragging women out into the street, their names printed in shame. Yet fines were paid, palms were greased, and the doors opened again the next night. Hypocrisy was the true currency of Victorian morality, and it spent well. But do not think the brothel was only cruelty. Within those walls were friendships, alliances, moments of laughter that rang true. Women shared rouge pots, patched each other's dresses, held each other when the sickness grew too sharp. They sang together, prayed together, even dreamed together, though dreams rarely lasted. And sometimes amid the darkness, there was love, crooked, battered, imperfect, but love nonetheless. A client who stayed, who offered protection. A fellow worker who became a sister in everything but name. Hope was not absent here. It was simply fragile, like a candle burning in a drafty room. Yet the shadows always returned. The brothel was not merely a house but a trap. Women aged quickly. Their beauty spent like currency until they were no longer profitable. Then came the gin shop, the street corner, the slow slide into obscurity. Children born here often never left. Daughters grew up to work the same beds their mothers had. And those who tried to leave found the world beyond unwelcoming. Once marked as fallen, society rarely forgave. Respectability was a door that locked from the inside, and once you stepped out, it never opened again. And you, standing in the corner of this dimly lit parlor, must ask yourself, do you pity them? Or do you fear them? Because Victorian society did both. Prostitutes were both despised and desired, scorned and sought after. They carried the burden of men's hypocrisy, blamed for sins they had been paid to commit. To walk these streets at night is to see that contradiction, laid bare respectability by day, hunger by night, and always the fog swallowing both as if London itself wished to forget. But the city does not forget. Its bricks remember. Its stones are damp with the footsteps of the women who walked them, their voices still whispering if you care to listen. For history is not only the story of kings and parliaments, of laws and wars, it is also the story of the women who sold survival 1 hour at a time, who lived and died in rooms society tried to erase. And perhaps, as the candles burn low and the streets outside fall silent, you realize the true cruelty of this world. It is not the brothel itself, nor even the diseases and dangers within. It is the gaze of society, the way it watched, judged, consumed, and discarded, and then washed its hands as though innocence could be restored with soap. That gaze is still with us. It lingers in the way we tell these stories, in the way we whisper about the fallen, instead of the driven, in the way we forget their names. So let us not forget. Let us walk once more into the parlour, past the red lamp, past the piano, past the mirror where a woman paints her lips with trembling hands. Let us sit with her for a moment, hear her story, share her silence. For only then do we see the truth, that beneath the lace, beneath the rouge, beneath the whispers and the laughter, there was a woman simply trying to live, and that is the most human story of all. Step carefully now. The fog is thicker here, the lamps fewer, the silence broken not by music, but by the distant clatter of boots against cobblestones. This is not the London of theatres or parlours, nor even of velvet-draped brothels. This is the underworld, the territory of pimps, gangs, and the shadowy figures who fatten themselves on the desperation of others. Every brothel had its owner, but many women never reached those safer doors. On the streets, survival meant aligning yourself with men who promised protection in exchange for obedience. They called them bullies, though the word feels too simple for what they were. Some were little more than thugs. Fists for hire, hands that struck harder than any client. Others were more sophisticated, managers of a cruel trade, who kept a ledger of girls like an accountant tracks his debts. Each coin that passed into a woman's hand was marked, tallied, and claimed. To disobey was to invite punishment, not always a blow, sometimes worse, abandonment, exposure, ruin. These bullies formed loose gangs, clusters of men who claimed territories the way wolves do. Streets were carved up invisibly, each corner known to belong to one man or another. Cross the line, and a woman risked not just her own safety, but the fury of an entire gang. Turf was sacred. A street corner could mean survival for a woman, profit for a pimp, blood for those who challenged it. And above the bullies stood the real lords of this underworld, men whose names rarely reached the newspapers, but whose presence was whispered in the gin shops. They were landlords who rented rooms at extortionate prices, tavern owners who doubled as madams, pawnbrokers who accepted a woman's last possessions before sending her back to the streets. Money trickled upward, and everyone along the way took a share. The women at the bottom received the least, but their sweat and suffering fueled an entire economy. The police, too, were part of this web. Not officially, not in the reports and speeches of commissioners, but in the back alleys where coins passed hand to hand. A constable could turn his eyes away for the right fee, or look too closely if payment was withheld. Raids came suddenly, but they often struck competitors more than partners. The law was not blind, it was selective, and its sight sharpened by bribes. And so the underworld and the law danced together, a waltz of corruption played out on damp cobblestones. Listen, and you will hear the slang of this hidden economy. Women called their pimps fancy men. Brothels became cribs or flash houses. A new girl was fresh, a word that meant both profit and danger. Diseases had their own cruel nicknames. The clap, pox, the French disease, as though mockery could soften the pain. The underworld spoke in its own tongue, a code both secretive and brazen, one that made the respectable shudder, even as they whispered it in curiosity. Violence was constant. A woman who defied her bully could be beaten, cut, left in the gutter. Clients, too, could be brutal, knowing that no one cared enough to protect her. The papers occasionally reported a murder, some unfortunate, found strangled or drowned, but most deaths went unremarked, folded into the city's endless churn of misery. Life was cheap here, and the women knew it. Each night was a gamble. Would the man who took her hand be kind, indifferent, or deadly? And yet, amid the cruelty, there was order of a kind. The gangs maintained a balance, brutal but predictable. Each district had its own figures of power, its own rhythms of crime. Pickpockets worked the theatres, thieves haunted the docks, and prostitutes filled the spaces between. Together, they formed an ecosystem, a dark mirror of the city's respectable world. Where above ground there were parliaments and banks, below there were flash houses and bullies. Where above there were ledgers and investments, below there were debts and bruises. The underworld was not chaos, it was simply a different kind of order. Sometimes, though, the two worlds collided. A gentleman might fall in love with a street girl, bringing her into a world she could never truly enter. A politician might be caught in a scandal, his name whispered in connection to a brothel. These stories fascinated the public, who devoured them in newspapers with a mix of horror and thrill. Each scandal was treated as shocking, though everyone knew such things were common. It was not the act itself that offended Victorian society, it was the exposure. Secrets were acceptable, revelations were not. The women trapped in this world bore the worst of both sides. Respectable society scorned them. The underworld consumed them. They were both indispensable and disposable, needed yet despised. To walk their streets was to walk a tightrope between danger and survival, between hunger and degradation. And still, they endured. Some grew hard, their faces lined, their eyes sharp. Others broke, slipping into madness or drink. A few rose, becoming madams themselves, wielding what power they could. Survival in this world was a kind of triumph. But the underworld was not static. It changed with the city, expanding as London grew. Railways brought more men, more money, more demand. Industrial poverty brought more women, more desperation, more supply. And always the gangs adapted, shifting, spreading, feeding on the endless river of lives. The city above might have celebrated progress, invention, empire. But beneath, in the shadows, progress meant only new ways to exploit, new avenues for misery. Imagine yourself here, walking with cautious steps down a narrow alley where gaslight barely touches the stones. You hear the whispers, the bargains struck in low voices. A door opens, revealing a glimpse of a girl's pale face, her smile rehearsed, her eyes tired. A man passes you, his hat pulled low, his coat drawn tight. He does not meet your gaze, no one does. Here, anonymity is safety, silence is survival. You feel the city's pulse, not in the clatter of carriages but in the quick, nervous heartbeats of those who live unseen. And as you emerge again into the fog, you realize the underworld is not beneath the city at all. It is inside it, woven into every street, every shadow, every silence. The respectable and the criminal, the rich and the desperate, the preacher and the pimp, all share the same streets, breathe the same smoke, live in the same city. The underworld is not another place, it is simply the part of London the light never touches. And in that darkness, the women remained. Not statistics, not shadows, but living, breathing souls who navigated danger with every step. Their stories, whispered and half forgotten, still linger in the stones of the alleys, waiting for ears patient enough to hear them. The underworld may have consumed their lives, but it cannot silence their echoes. The night air is colder now, damp enough that your lungs feel heavy when you breathe. You step out of the alley, and for a moment, the fog curls away to reveal a pale figure leaning against the wall. She is young, or perhaps not. Sickness ages faces faster than years. Her cheeks are hollow, her lips pale, and though she straightens when she notices you, there is a heaviness in her stance that no performance can disguise. This is the other face of the trade, not the swagger of pimps or the dangers of the streets, but the slow, consuming weight of disease. Victorian London had many words for it. The doctors wrote venereal disease in their notes. The newspapers printed the more genteel, social evil. On the streets, the slang was rougher. The clap, pox, the French disease. The names did not matter, the suffering was the same. For the poor, disease was as common as hunger and as difficult to escape. The air itself seemed to conspire against them, carrying coughs and fevers through damp rooms and crowded alleys. And for the women who sold their bodies, there was an extra shadow waiting at every embrace. Infection. Syphilis was the great terror, a disease that lingered like a curse. At first it was a small sore, often ignored or hidden. Then it spread, attacking the skin, the bones, the very mind. Faces collapsed into grotesque masks, teeth fell out, madness crept in. Untreated, it did not just kill, it transformed. turning people into unrecognizable husks of themselves. In polite society, it was a whispered scandal, something doctors might hint at with coded words. In the slums, it was simply another fact of life. Then there was gonorrhea, the clap. Painful, humiliating, it robbed women of dignity, and sometimes of fertility. Left untreated, it could inflame the body until even walking became torment. Add to this the endless list of other ailments: tuberculosis, typhus, cholera, measles, influenza, and you begin to understand that sickness was not an exception here. It was the backdrop of existence. What made it worse was the medicine. Today, we imagine hospitals as places of healing, white walls and clean sheets. In Victorian London, they were something else entirely. For the poor, the workhouse infirmary was the last resort, a place to die more than to recover. Doctors experimented freely, often cruelly, using poor patients as practice. Treatments for venereal disease were worse than the sickness itself. Mercury was the favored cure: swallowed, rubbed on the skin, injected into wounds. It made teeth fall out, hair thin, skin peel. A night with Venus, they used to say, and a lifetime with Mercury. The cure could kill as efficiently as the disease. Imagine being one of these women, her body already worn from hunger and exhaustion, and being told she must swallow poison in order to live. Some refused, clinging to gin as their only medicine. Others submitted, enduring months of agony for the faint chance of survival. The irony was cruel men who infected them often walked free, untested, unpunished. Women bore the burden not only of sickness but of blame. The government eventually stepped in, but not with kindness. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s allowed police to seize any woman suspected of prostitution and subject her to invasive medical examinations. These speculum exams, performed without consent, were as degrading as any assault. The women were forced into lock hospitals, treated with mercury, and held until deemed clean. Men, meanwhile, were untouched by the law. It was a system that punished the victims while ignoring the cause, cloaking cruelty in the language of morality and hygiene. Picture one of those hospitals, a long ward with rows of narrow beds, the air thick with disinfectant and despair. Women lay still, their eyes dull, their bodies weak. Nurses moved briskly between them, sometimes kind, sometimes scornful. A doctor in a dark coat carried his instruments with the detachment of a butcher. The women knew they were being watched, judged, measured not only by their pulse but by their perceived worth. Survival was not the same as dignity. Often, the two were mutually exclusive. And yet, the human spirit has a way of clawing through even the deepest despair. Some women found ways to endure, to joke even in sickness. They mocked the doctors behind their backs, shared remedies among themselves. Herbal brews, poultices, tricks passed down from mothers and grandmothers. Garlic, vinegar, certain teas, anything that might ease the pain or mask the symptoms. They became their own healers, not always successfully, but defiantly. In a world that stripped them of control, reclaiming their own bodies, even in small ways, was an act of rebellion. The streets themselves carried the scent of disease. Walk down Ratcliffe Highway or through Spitalfields, and you would catch the sour tang of sickness on the air. Coughs echoed in narrow courts. The cries of infants punctuated the night. Children were not spared. Many were born already infected, tiny bodies carrying the sins of their fathers. Infant mortality soared, and each death was a quiet tragedy folded into the city's larger indifference. For every woman who suffered, there was often a child who did not survive at all. The cruelty of it all was not just in the suffering, but in the hypocrisy. The same society that condemned these women as fallen was often the one infecting them. Respectable men visited brothels in secret, then returned to their homes, their wives, their reputations intact. The women bore the blame, the punishment, the scars. Morality was never evenly applied. In Victorian London, it was a weapon, and the weak were always its target. If you listen closely here, in this cold fog-bound street, you can almost hear the whispers of those women, their stories stitched into the very air. They speak of nights spent coughing until dawn, of the taste of mercury on the tongue, of doctors' hands that felt no different from a client's. They speak of the fear that each kiss, each touch, might be the one that ended them. They speak, above all, of endurance. The quiet, stubborn refusal to vanish without leaving some trace. And as you step away from that pale figure leaning against the wall, You carry her voice with you. Disease was not just an illness in Victorian London, it was a shadow that touched every breath, every embrace, every life. It shaped the city as much as the railways or the factories, carving its history into the bones of those who lived and died unseen. And if you think this shadow was cruel, wait until you feel the weight of the so-called saviors, the reformers and rescuers who claimed to help, but often only tightened the chains. You can hear the bell first, a sharp, self-important clang cutting through the fog. Then comes the voice, high, righteous, trembling with purpose. "Repent, sisters! Save your souls while there is still time." It belongs to a woman with iron, grey hair, and a bonnet tied so tightly under her chin that it looks as if it might cut off the circulation to her brain. In one hand she carries a Bible, in the other a pamphlet with large block letters, "Fallen Women Restored to Purity." Welcome to the curious world of Victorian reformers, a carnival of moral crusaders, religious zealots, and well-meaning philanthropists, all of whom had one thing in common: they wanted to save the poor. Or at least, they wanted to be seen saving them. On paper, their goals sounded noble. They opened Magdalene homes and rescue societies, offering women a chance to leave the streets, abandon prostitution, and embrace a life of virtue. They promised food, shelter, work, and above all, redemption. The catch, of course, was that redemption came at a price: obedience. A woman might trade her nightly hunt for clients for endless prayers, harsh discipline, and a lifetime of laundry. She would be washed, clothed, renamed, and taught to scrub floors until her fingers bled. Because in Victorian London, nothing cleans the soul quite like cleaning other people's linen. Step inside one of these homes, and you might be forgiven for mistaking it for a prison. The doors locked from the outside, the windows barred. The women rose at dawn, filed into chapel, and spent hours bent over tubs of steaming water. Silence was enforced, laughter discouraged, individuality erased. Each woman became part of a mass, a row of bowed heads chanting psalms in unison. Reform, it seemed, was not about freedom but about control. It is hard not to notice the irony. Here were women who had been condemned for selling themselves to survive, now condemned again if they dared show too much spirit in their new, respectable life. A prostitute on the street might have faced hunger and danger, but at least she chose her clients, chose her hours, chose her gin. In a rescue home, choice was stripped away entirely. Virtue meant submission, and rebellion meant expulsion, back to the streets, where the cycle began again. The reformers were not always cruel for cruelty's sake. Many genuinely believed they were saving souls. But their vision of salvation was narrow, rigid, and blind to reality. They could not imagine that poverty, not sin, might drive a woman to prostitution. They did not see hunger as an excuse, only as evidence of moral weakness. They did not look at the landlords charging extortionate rents, or the employers paying starvation wages, or the men who bought women's bodies with impunity. They looked only at the women, and declared them fallen. Some reformers were men, self-styled guardians of morality. Picture a portly gentleman with a waistcoat stretched tight over his belly, striding into a Magdalene home to lecture women about chastity. His own evening habits, of course, were not up for discussion. The hypocrisy was almost comical, if it were not so cruel. Others were women of higher class, society ladies who spent their afternoons in drawing rooms, raising funds for the cause. They organized charity balls, where silk-gowned ladies waltzed under chandeliers, in order to provide a pittance for the poor. There is something absurd in imagining a glittering ballroom, full of champagne glasses, the air thick with perfume, while outside the women they claimed to help stood shivering in thin shawls, coughing into their hands. And yet, for all the absurdity, these reformers did wield power. Their pamphlets filled newspapers, their speeches stirred crowds, their charities shaped policy. They could dictate the terms of help, decide who was worthy and who was beyond saving. Respectability was the currency, and the poor were forever in debt. You cannot help but overhear the conversations inside one of these charity parlors. "She has a good face," says one reformer, peering at a young woman as though she were a horse at auction. "She might make a decent maid, if only she will pray." Another clucks her tongue. "This one is too far gone. Look at her eyes. A wicked soul if ever I saw one." The women sit silently, heads bowed, knowing that their fates are being decided not by their own hands, but by the whims of strangers. The most infamous of these efforts was the rescue mission in the streets. Reformers would march through slum neighborhoods, Bibles in hand, attempting to pluck women off the corners. Imagine a group of bonneted ladies descending on a prostitute in Whitechapel, urging her to abandon her sinful ways, while a client waited impatiently across the street. More often than not, the women laughed in their faces, or swore at them, or demanded money in exchange for their time. Rescue, after all, did not pay the rent. The cruelty, once again, lay in the double standards. A man could stumble into a brothel on Saturday night and sit in church on Sunday morning without comment. A woman who entered the same brothel to survive was branded forever as fallen. Society was willing to forgive men their vices, but women were expected to embody purity itself. Once stained, they could never be clean. And yet, in the cracks of this rigid system, some women turned the situation to their advantage. A Magdalene home meant a roof, food, even if it was meager, and sometimes they used the opportunity to rest, recover, and then slip back onto the streets when they were ready. Others played the part of the penitent to perfection, knowing exactly which prayers to recite, which tears to shed, in order to secure a little more leniency. Survival required performance, whether as a temptress in the alley or as a saint in training in the rescue home. If you listen closely in these places, you will hear not just the voices of reformers but the whispers of rebellion. The women gossip as they scrub, mock the pious sermons, share jokes in the laundry steam. Humor became a weapon here, a way to resist the crushing seriousness of their supposed saviors. To laugh at the absurdity was to reclaim some measure of dignity. And outside, the city goes on. The factories roar, the pubs spill out drunken men, the alleys teem with hungry children. The rescue homes, for all their fervor, are a tiny island in a vast sea of suffering. They cannot possibly absorb all the women who need help. They pick and choose, save a handful, discard the rest. The majority return to the streets, their lives unchanged. The cycle continues endlessly, while reformers write new pamphlets and congratulate themselves on their good work. It leaves you with the sense that reform in Victorian London was less about saving the poor than about soothing the conscience of the rich. It was a spectacle of morality, a performance played out in chapels and parlours, while the real engines of poverty, inequality, exploitation, neglect, roared on unchecked. As you leave the clang of that bell behind and slip once more into the fog, you carry with you the bitter taste of hypocrisy. The reformers may have shouted loud, but their voices could never drown out the truth, whispered by the streets. Poverty was not a sin, and suffering was not a choice. And if you thought these moral crusaders were severe, just wait until you step into the grim stone walls of the workhouse, where poverty was punished with a discipline that made even the Magdalene homes look merciful. You feel it before you see it. The stone walls loom in your imagination long before you arrive. Cold, grey, unforgiving. The workhouse is less a refuge than a fortress. Its gates swallow you whole, iron teeth closing behind you with a clang that echoes in your bones. Outside, the city still heaves with the noise of carts, hawkers, and drunken songs. Inside, the world goes silent, stripped of laughter, stripped of warmth. This is where poverty is punished, where hunger is disciplined, where the poor are told that their suffering is their own fault. The workhouse was meant to be the last resort, the safety net for those with nowhere left to fall. That was the theory, at least. In practice, it was a machine designed to grind people down until they regretted ever crossing its threshold. The idea was simple. If life inside was made unbearable, then only the truly desperate would seek its walls. Charity, the Victorians decided, must be laced with cruelty, lest it encourage laziness. Step through the gates, and the first thing you lose is your family. Husbands separated from wives, children torn from mothers, brothers divided from sisters. The poor, who clung together on the streets in order to survive, were split apart the moment they entered the workhouse. Love was considered a luxury, family bonds a distraction. To help the poor, the system first broke their hearts. Then came the washing. Stripped of your clothes, the last shreds of individuality you possessed, you are scrubbed like a carcass at market. Your hair may be cut, your belongings confiscated. You are handed a uniform, stiff and coarse, the same as every other inmate. Whatever life you lived before, whatever stories your garments carried, are erased. You are now a number, a body to be fed as cheaply as possible, worked as hard as possible, and disciplined at every turn. The food arrives in tin bowls, bland and insufficient. Gruel, the infamous thin porridge of legend, is real enough, though sometimes it is accompanied by a scrap of bread, or a potato, or, if fortune smiles, a morsel of cheese. Meat is a rarity, more rumor than reality. Hunger gnaws at the belly constantly, a dull ache that never fades. The rules allow no second helpings, no sharing, no comfort. To eat in a workhouse is not to be nourished but to be reminded of your place. The work is ceaseless. Men break stones, pound hemp, or labor at back-breaking tasks that serve no purpose beyond discipline. Women scrub, mend, launder until their hands crack and bleed. Children pick oakum, untwisting old ropes fiber by fiber, their small fingers rubbed raw by tar and grit. The labor is designed not for productivity but for humiliation, to remind the poor that every mouthful must be earned in sweat and silence. And silence itself is enforced with zeal. Talk is restricted, laughter punished, disobedience swiftly corrected. A misstep, a murmur, a glance, a sigh, might be met with solitary confinement, with bread and water rations, with the loss of even the meager privileges allowed. Inmates are made to feel that their every breath is borrowed, their existence tolerated only because the alternative would be death in the street. At night, the dormitories echo with coughs and sobs. Rows of iron beds stretch into the shadows, bodies curled beneath thin blankets. The air is thick with damp, with the smell of unwashed skin and disinfectant. Rats scurry between floorboards, bold enough to climb onto beds in search of crumbs. Children cry for mothers they cannot see, mothers cry for children they cannot hold. Sleep offers no escape. Only a brief respite before another day of grinding labor and hunger. Yet the cruelty of the workhouse was not merely physical. It was psychological. The system was built on shame. To enter was to admit failure, to bear the brand of poverty as a moral weakness. The poor were taught to see themselves as unworthy, as burdens. They were called paupers, as if their poverty defined their humanity. The workhouse did not simply feed empty stomachs, it sought to starve out dignity. There are stories whispered even outside its walls, of mothers who refused to enter, because they would not be parted from their children, choosing instead to die on the streets. Of old men who preferred the slow death of hunger to the degradation of being caged. Of children who entered bright-eyed and left hollow, their childhood dissolved in endless labor. And yet, paradoxically, the workhouse was often full. Because what choice did the poor have? When the landlord raised the rent, when wages dropped to pennies, when illness struck, when winter closed in, the workhouse gates loomed as the final, dreadful option. Families resisted until the very last, but hunger is a ruthless persuader. Better to live in misery than to die in the gutter. Or so the system counted on. It is impossible to miss the hypocrisy. Outside, the wealthy debated charity over lavish dinners, sipping wine and discussing the virtues of self-reliance. They argued that the poor must be taught discipline, while servants stood behind them, silent, holding platters heavy with roast beef. Inside the workhouse, men gnawed crusts of bread so thin they barely filled a tooth. Charity, it seemed, was a performance for the rich, a sentence for the poor. But for all its cruelty, the workhouse never quite achieved what it set out to do. Poverty did not vanish. The streets did not empty. The desperate still came, and the cycle continued. Inmates left only to return. Children grew up within its walls, only to end up back there as adults. The machine ground on, consuming lives, but never solving the hunger that fed it. And so the workhouse stands as a monument to Victorian contradictions. A society that prided itself on progress and industry, that celebrated wealth and empire, yet treated its poorest with a brutality that bordered on sadism. A society that built railways across continents and factories that roared with steam, but could not bring itself to feed a child without first shaming them. As you stand at the barred window and look out through the fog, you might feel the weight of those walls pressing on you still. They were built not only of stone but of fear. The fear of poverty, the fear of failure, the fear of being cast out. The workhouse was a threat whispered in every slum, a shadow that haunted every poor man's dream. Step out of line, and this will be your fate. And when you finally leave, if you are lucky enough to leave. You carry that shadow with you forever. The sound of the gates slamming shut, the taste of gruel, the memory of separation. Poverty is cruel, but the workhouse made it crueler still. Because in Victorian London, to be poor was not only to be hungry, not only to be cold, but to be punished for existing at all. The air changes the moment you step off the main road. The city no longer smells of bread, coal smoke, and horse dung. It smells of damp brick, unwashed bodies, and something sharp and metallic, like the tang of fear mixed with cheap gin. Welcome to the underbelly of Victorian London, where law and order take a polite bow at the entrance and never bother stepping inside. Here, the poor survive not through workhouses or charity sermons, but through cunning crime and sheer audacity. Your boots splash into a puddle that's more sewage than water, and already you feel eyes on you. Not the curious gaze of street vendors or the distracted stare of children, but calculating eyes, measuring you up, pocket to pocket, button to button, weighing whether you're worth the risk of a quick snatch. This is the kingdom of pickpockets, cracksmen, and scuttlers, where a skilled hand can turn a gentleman's watch into supper for a week, and a careless turn can land you in Newgate prison. And the children are the first you notice. Not the sweet cherubs you see painted in family portraits, but ragged little imps in caps too big for their heads, with eyes sharp as needles. They swarm like flocks of sparrows around crowded markets, slipping between legs and vanishing beneath horse carts. Their fingers are quick, their feet quicker. You might brush one off with a laugh, thinking him a harmless beggar, until you realize your handkerchief, or worse, your purse, has vanished. These are the famous street Arabs, as the Victorians rather unkindly called them, and they live on wit, speed, and the misfortune of distracted passers-by. If you think crime here is haphazard, you'd be mistaken. The city's underworld is organized, its gears greased with desperation and opportunity. At the top of the chain are the fences, the sly shopkeepers who'll buy stolen goods with a wink and resell them to respectable customers who'd rather not ask questions. Below them are the cracksmen, burglars skilled enough to open locks with a touch and disappear like smoke before the bobbies arrive. Then there are the bludgers, the muscle of the streets, whose fists do the talking in taverns when a debt isn't paid. And binding it all together, invisible threads of gang loyalty and survival, is the constant need for coin. In the rookeries, those infamous mazes of alleys and tenements, crime isn't an exception, it's the economy. St. Giles, Seven Dials, Whitechapel. Each has its own flavour of lawlessness, its own gangs staking claims like landlords of vice. In some, whole families work together. The father a cracksman, the mother a fence, the children trained from infancy to slip a gentleman's snuff box without breaking stride. Family businesses, though not exactly the sort you'd advertise in polite company. And let's not forget the women. Far from passive victims, they were as active in the underworld as the men. Female pickpockets worked markets, laundresses hid stolen goods in soapy tubs, and prostitutes doubled as informants, luring clients into traps where waiting accomplices relieved them of their watches and dignity. In a city where honest wages for women barely bought bread, crime offered a kind of independence, albeit at the constant risk of violence or the hangman's rope. The taverns are where you really feel it, the pulse of the underworld. Step inside one of the dim, lit gin palaces of the East End, and you'll hear it. The clatter of dice on a back table, the rustle of cards shuffled beneath the counter, the clink of bottles passed hand to hand. Here, deals are struck over greasy tankards, and secrets slip freer than the owl. In the corner, a gang of costermongers, street sellers by day, brawlers by night, swap stories of knife fights. At the bar, a thief brags too loudly about a silver chain he lifted, only to be relieved of it by the time he stumbles home. Trust, in this world, is about as sturdy as a damp match. It's easy to romanticize them now, these Victorian rogues with their quick wit and sharper knives. Literature certainly did. Think of Dickens's artful dodger, charming as he is unscrupulous. But behind the tales was a raw truth. Most thieves weren't charming, they were starving. They weren't rebels against society, they were casualties of it. When a loaf of bread could mean the difference between eating and not, the leap from begging to stealing wasn't a leap at all. It was a shuffle forward. Still, There was a strange code of honor in the underworld. Certain victims were off limits. A poor man's pocket wasn't worth the trouble, and stealing from neighbors could earn you a beating worse than any magistrate would hand down. The wealthy, the careless, the drunk, those were fair game. Call it the Victorian version of progressive taxation, except administered with quick fingers and the occasional blackjack. And of course, crime bred punishment. The police, those newly minted bobbies, patrolled the streets with their rattles and lanterns, earnest but often outmatched. In the narrow alleys, gangs knew the corners better, the rooftops quicker, the shadows darker. Arrests did happen, but prisons were crowded proof that desperation always outpaced law enforcement. Inside Newgate, the grim reality awaited cold cells, the stink of damp stone, and the knowledge that for serious offences, the gallows still loomed. Public hangings, though gradually falling out of fashion, drew crowds by the thousands. Imagine it: children perched on shoulders, vendors hawking pies, laughter and gossip in the air, while a man swung from a rope as an example to all. Crime, punishment, and entertainment in one grotesque package. Yet for every thief who ended on the scaffold, dozens melted back into the alleys, ready to try again the next night. Poverty was the great recruiter, and London provided no shortage of recruits. And sometimes you can't help but notice, crime wasn't merely tolerated. It was woven into the city's fabric. Wealthy men gambled in clubs with fortunes they never earned. Landlords squeezed rent from hovels unfit for animals. Merchants diluted goods and sold them at full price. Was that not crime, too, dressed up in respectable clothes? The poor might have stolen with bare hands, but the rich stole with ledgers and contracts. The gallows, though, were only for one side. By now, the air feels heavy. The lantern light dimmer, the laughter of the tavern menacing instead of merry. You start to realize, this underworld wasn't separate from Victorian London. It was its shadow. Wherever wealth glittered, poverty clung close by, and with it came the crime that poverty bred. So you walk a little faster, ears pricked for footsteps behind you, eyes darting to the glint of knives in the dark. Somewhere, a child's laugh cuts through the night, a light sound, but when you glance over, he's already gone. And so is the pocket watch you swore was safe. If you think this world is suffocating, if the alleys seem already too dark and crowded with desperation, wait until you step into the next and final place. Because nothing, not even the workhouse or the gallows, will prepare you for what it feels like to walk into the Victorian graveyard. The night presses heavier here than anywhere else. You've walked through alleys of hunger, rookeries of crime, workhouses of despair, but nothing compares to this place, the graveyards of Victorian London. They were never silent, not really. They groaned with the weight of centuries, of bodies piled atop bodies, of the city's endless supply of dead. If London by day was crowded, London by death was even more so. You push open the rusted iron gate of a parish churchyard, and the smell greets you before the sight does. Earth, damp and sour. Lime, sharp in the nostrils. And beneath it all, that faint sweetness, unmistakable, that clings to decay no matter how deeply it's buried. By candlelight or moonlight you see the ground is uneven, bulging in strange mounds, sunken in others, as if the very earth is tired of swallowing more. That's because it is. In the early 19th century, London's graveyards were already full in the most literal, horrifying sense. Parish plots meant for a few hundred burials over decades were forced to take thousands. Graves were dug shallow, coffins stacked atop each other like firewood, sometimes broken open, bones rearranged to make space. Soil itself seemed to reject it, spitting up fragments after heavy rains. To walk through certain churchyards was to crunch over splintered coffin wood and, if you were unlucky, something far worse. The poor had no choice but to accept it. Death was as democratic as hunger. It came for everyone, but the treatment of your corpse was dictated by your purse. The wealthy enjoyed vaults, ornate headstones, funeral processions with plumes of black feathers and horses draped in velvet. The poor had pauper burials, mass graves, unmarked. The cheapest coffin, if they had one at all. Some were laid down wrapped in nothing more than a shroud, lowered into pits, where dozens followed. The grave digger's spade was the only sermon. Families dreaded this indignity almost as much as they dreaded hunger in life. It gave rise to the burial clubs, grim little societies where, for a few pennies a week, working men and women bought the one dignity they could hope for: a decent funeral. Think of them as life insurance plans with none of the security and all of the risk. If you kept up your payments, you might have a coffin, a proper procession, maybe even a gravestone. Fail, and into the pauper's pit you went. And here's where the humor creeps in, dark as soot. Some clubs weren't exactly reputable. More than a few were little better than scams, collapsing when too many members inconveniently died at once. Others became excuses for pub gatherings, the weekly contributions spent on gin, before a penny made it to the undertaker. There were even whispered tales of unscrupulous families hastening the death of a sick relative. After all, a funeral payout was sometimes worth more than keeping a fevered uncle alive. Grim arithmetic, but poverty forces strange equations. The undertakers, meanwhile, grew rich. The trade of death, as contemporaries called it, was one of the city's most profitable businesses. Funeral pomp was an obsession in Victorian culture, and even the poorest tried to stretch their means to afford at least a modest show. Black plumes, black gloves, black ribbons on the neighbors' doors. It was theatre, and death was the stage. The undertaker was both stage manager and accountant, and he knew his clients well, desperate, grieving, terrified of shame. Prices were adjusted accordingly. Step outside the crowded parish grounds and into the great cemeteries built later. The Magnificent Seven. Highgate, Kensal Green, Nunhead. Vast landscape necropolises, with winding paths and Gothic tombs, designed to lure the wealthy dead out of the overflowing city. Here, ivy clung to angels carved in marble, and iron railings guarded mausoleums like cages for the rich even in death. It was quiet, serene, almost beautiful. But remember, these were for those who could afford it. The poor were left to rot in the old churchyards, their bones pushed aside for the next occupant. And then there was the fear, more chilling than any graveyard shadow, the fear of being buried alive. Medicine was far from perfect, and tales spread of coffins open to find scratch marks inside, bodies twisted in agony. To calm such terrors, inventors devised safety coffins, fitted with bells or breathing tubes, so the prematurely buried could summon help. Imagine walking past a graveyard at midnight and hearing a faint ringing from beneath the soil. Comforting. Not quite. But the poor didn't have safety coffins. They had lime pits. Quicklime was shoveled over pauper corpses to hasten decay and mask the stench. If the wealthy dead were monuments, the poor dead were maintenance. The city needed them gone, quickly, efficiently, and anonymously. Their names vanished with their flesh. And yet, even here, there was profit. Resurrectionists, the so-called body snatchers, haunted graveyards at night, digging up fresh corpses to sell to medical schools for dissection. It was a booming trade before the Anatomy Act of 1832, and though it slowed after, rumors persisted that some doctors still preferred the freshness of stolen cadavers. Poor families, unable to afford strong coffins or guards, sometimes sat by gravesides all night with lanterns, keeping watch until the earth settled. Not to honor their loved one, but to protect them from a second violation. Death, then, was not an end but a negotiation. How much dignity could you afford? How much humiliation could you avoid? The Victorians had a word for the state of the poor: respectability. And even in death, respectability was currency. A decent funeral meant you had lived and died as something more than refuse. Now as you stand at the edge of a pauper's pit, the lamplight flickering weakly against the dark, you begin to realize something. All those alleys, all those taverns, all those workhouses, they led here. The hunger, the crime, the sickness. It all funneled into the same earth. The city might rise higher each year with its railways, bridges, and grand buildings. But beneath it, the ground swelled with the bones of those who never saw the inside of a parlor, who never owned a proper bed, who never made it beyond survival. You take a breath, heavy with damp earth and sorrow, and for a moment you think you hear it. The murmurs of the countless poor, layered in the soil like pages in a book no one bothered to read. They whisper of hunger, of toil, of laughter that once cut through the darkness, of children who played in alleys before vanishing into pits. Their story is not carved in stone, not written in gilt letters, but it lingers here, in the restless air of the graveyard. And when you finally step back through the iron gate, leaving the dead to their uneasy rest, you know something important. Victorian poverty was not just about life. It was about how even in death, the poor could not escape the weight of the city pressing down upon them. But listen, don't let it crush you. Because beyond the sorrow, there is a strange peace. The graveyard is quiet, the city's roar muffled, the stars dimmed but steady above. And perhaps, in that silence, the forgotten finally find what they were denied in life: rest.